Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in Tallahassee history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1854, the city of Tallahassee stood as the capital of Florida, a place where Spanish moss draped ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, and the humid air carried whispers of secrets buried deep in plantation soil. The red hills surrounding the city held stories that proper society preferred to forget, but some tales refused to remain silent. This is the documented account of events that transpired at the Warren estate, located 7 miles northeast of the city center, along what was then known as Meridian Road. The Warren plantation encompassed nearly 2,000 acres of rolling hills and dense woodland. The main house, a 2-story structure built in the Greek Revival style, sat atop the highest hill on the property, its white columns visible from the road below. Behind the main house, a collection of outbuildings dotted the landscape: the kitchen house, smokehouse, and quarters for the enslaved workers who labored on the tobacco and cotton fields that stretched toward the Ochlockonee River. Records from the Leon County Courthouse indicate that Edmund Warren purchased the property in 1849, paying the substantial sum of $12,000 to the previous owner, a planter named Josiah Mitchell, who had fallen into debt. Warren arrived from South Carolina with his wife Margaret and their 2 adult children, Thomas, aged 23, and Elizabeth, 21. The family brought with them 37 enslaved individuals, among them a young woman whose name appears in the plantation ledger as Lydia. The Warren family's arrival in Tallahassee was noted in the local newspaper, the Florida Sentinel, which described Edmund Warren as a gentleman of considerable means and refined character, whose presence will surely benefit our growing community. The family attended services at the Episcopal Church of the Ascension on Park Avenue, and Margaret Warren was welcomed into the Ladies' Benevolent Society. By all appearances, they were model citizens of the antebellum South. According to plantation records discovered in the Leon County Historical Society archives in 1963, Lydia was approximately 18 years old when she arrived at the Warren estate. The ledger describes her as mulatto, medium height, skilled in household duties. Her previous owner had been a Charleston merchant who sold her to Warren to settle gambling debts. Unlike many of the field hands, Lydia was assigned to work in the main house, tending to the family's daily needs and maintaining the interior rooms. The first documented irregularity appears in a letter written by Margaret Warren to her sister in Charleston, dated November 15, 1854. The letter, preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society and later examined by researchers in 1967, contains a passage that would prove significant. The new girl, Lydia, has proven most peculiar in her manner. She speaks little and moves through the house as if she carries some terrible burden. Thomas has taken notice of her, which concerns me greatly. I fear there is something unwholesome in her past that follows her here. Reverend William Thornton of the Episcopal Church kept detailed records of his pastoral visits to parishioners' homes. His diary, discovered during church renovations in 1961, contains entries describing his visits to the Warren plantation. An entry dated December 3, 1854, reads, "Called upon the Warren family today. Found the household in a state of peculiar tension. The servant girl who answered the door appeared frightened, though of what I cannot say. Mrs. Warren spoke in hushed tones throughout my visit, and young Thomas seemed agitated. When I inquired about their spiritual well-being, Mr. Warren changed the subject to matters of business." The winter of 1854 brought unusually cold weather to North Florida. Frost killed much of the late cotton crop, and the plantation faced financial difficulties. Edmund Warren's correspondence with his factor in New Orleans, found in the Howard Tilton Memorial Library at Tulane University, reveals his growing concern about mounting debts and the need to increase productivity on the plantation. In a letter dated January 8, 1855, Warren wrote, "The demands upon us grow daily, and I fear we must take measures to ensure greater efficiency in all aspects of our operations." It was during this period of financial stress that the first disturbing reports began to emerge. Sarah Mitchell, an elderly enslaved woman who worked in the kitchen house, would later provide testimony to a traveling minister who recorded her words in his journal. According to her account, preserved in the archives of Bethune-Cookman College, Lydia began experiencing what could only be described as episodes of extreme distress. She would wake in the night, crying out words none of us understood, Sarah testified. Sometimes she would disappear for hours, and we would find her standing in the woods, staring at nothing. Indeed, the isolation of the Warren plantation from the main road and neighboring properties created an environment where unusual occurrences could easily remain hidden from outside scrutiny. The nearest neighbor, Colonel James Gadsden, lived nearly 3 miles away across difficult terrain. The enslaved quarters were positioned deliberately out of sight of the main house, separated by a grove of live oaks and a small creek. This arrangement, common on many plantations, ensured that the daily lives of the enslaved workers remained largely invisible to visitors and casual observers. Thomas Warren, according to multiple sources, began spending increasing amounts of time away from the main house. His sister Elizabeth wrote to a friend in Charleston that Thomas has taken to long rides through the countryside and often returns well after dark. The letter, dated February 14, 1855, continues, "Father grows impatient with his absences, particularly as the work of the plantation requires constant supervision. There are whispers among the servants that Thomas has formed an improper attachment, though Mother refuses to discuss such matters." The spring of 1855 brought no relief to the mounting tensions at the Warren estate. Records from the Tallahassee branch of the Bank of Florida show that Edmund Warren requested additional loans against his property, citing temporary difficulties in cash flow. The bank's president, William Williams, noted in his personal diary that Warren appeared haggard and distracted during their meeting. Williams wrote, "The man seems aged beyond his years and spoke of burdens that extend beyond mere financial concerns." A traveling physician, Dr. Henry Morrison, kept detailed notes of his calls throughout Leon County. His medical journal, donated to the Florida State University archives by his descendants in 1958, contains an entry describing a visit to the Warren plantation in April 1855. Morrison wrote, "Called to attend to the young woman Lydia, who was reported to be suffering from nervous complaints. Found her in a state of extreme agitation, unable to provide coherent responses to questions about her condition. The family requested discretion in the matter, and I prescribed laudanum for her nerves." The same month, a fire destroyed the plantation's tobacco-curing barn, along with the season's entire crop. The Leon County fire investigation records, such as they were in that era, indicate that the blaze began in the early hours of the morning and burned so fiercely that it could be seen from Tallahassee. No definitive cause was ever established, though Edmund Warren reported to his insurance company that he suspected arson. The loss represented nearly $4,000 in damaged property and crops. Lydia's behavior became increasingly erratic following the fire. According to testimony later provided by other enslaved individuals on the plantation, she would often be found wandering the burned ruins of the tobacco barn, speaking to herself in what sounded like prayers or incantations. Moses Jenkins, an elderly man who worked as the plantation's blacksmith, told a visiting Methodist circuit rider that the girl seemed to be carrying on conversations with spirits only she could see. The summer months brought oppressive heat and humidity to the plantation, along with a series of unexplained incidents. Livestock began dying without apparent cause, and several of the enslaved workers reported seeing strange lights moving through the woods at night. Margaret Warren's letters to her sister become increasingly agitated during this period. In a letter dated July 20th, 1855, she wrote, "I fear our home has become cursed by some malevolent force. The very air seems thick with dread, and I find myself unable to sleep peacefully." Thomas Warren's behavior grew more disturbing as the summer progressed. According to Elizabeth Warren's diary, discovered in the attic of the family home in 1964, Thomas would disappear for days at a time without explanation. When he returned, he appeared wild-eyed and unkempt, as if he had been living rough in the wilderness. The diary entry for August 5th, 1855 reads, "Thomas returned today after an absence of 4 days. He spoke little of where he had been, but I noticed his clothes were stained with what appeared to be mud and something darker." The Methodist minister who had been recording testimonies from enslaved individuals on various plantations throughout the region left detailed notes about his visits to the Warren estate. Reverend Samuel Tucker's journal, housed in the United Methodist Archives at Drew University, describes meeting with Lydia in late August 1855. According to Tucker's account, Lydia spoke in fragmented sentences about the weight of chains that cannot be seen and the price paid for silence. The minister noted that she seemed to be in a state of profound spiritual torment. As autumn arrived, the situation at the Warren plantation reached a crisis point. On September 15th, 1855, Lydia vanished from the estate entirely. According to the report filed with the Leon County Sheriff's Office, she was last seen near the quarters just after sunset. A search of the surrounding woods and fields yielded no trace of her whereabouts. Edmund Warren offered a $50 reward for information leading to her recovery, a substantial sum that indicated the urgency he felt about her disappearance. The search for Lydia lasted nearly 2 weeks and involved volunteers from neighboring plantations, as well as professional slave catchers brought in from Georgia. The Tallahassee Sentinel reported on the search efforts, noting that every effort is being made to locate the missing girl, whose disappearance has caused considerable concern throughout the county. Despite the extensive search, no physical evidence of Lydia's fate was ever discovered. Thomas Warren's reaction to Lydia's disappearance was particularly striking to those who witnessed it. According to his sister's diary, he became nearly inconsolable and spent days riding through the countryside calling her name. Elizabeth wrote, "It is as if Thomas has lost his very soul. Father has forbidden him from participating further in the search, fearing that his obvious distress will invite unwelcome speculation about the nature of his interest in the girl's welfare." The weeks following Lydia's disappearance brought a series of disturbing developments to the Warren plantation. Several enslaved workers reported hearing screams coming from the direction of the main house in the middle of the night. Others spoke of finding strange markings carved into trees throughout the property. Moses Jenkins told Reverend Tucker that evil has taken root in this place, and it grows stronger each day that passes. Margaret Warren's health began to deteriorate significantly during this period. Dr. Morrison's journal records multiple visits to treat her for what he described as nervous exhaustion brought on by extreme stress. In an entry dated October 10th, 1855, Morrison wrote, "Mrs. Warren appears to be suffering from a complete breakdown of her nervous system. She speaks constantly of strange sounds coming from within the walls of the house and claims to smell scents that others cannot detect." The Warren family's standing in Tallahassee society began to suffer as rumors spread about the unusual events at their plantation. Invitations to social gatherings became less frequent, and Margaret Warren was quietly removed from her position in the Ladies' Benevolent Society. Reverend Thornton's diary indicates that the family's attendance at church services became sporadic, and when they did appear, they sat apart from other parishioners. In November 1855, a second fire broke out on the Warren property, this time destroying the kitchen house and damaging part of the main residence. The blaze occurred during a thunderstorm, but several witnesses noted that the fire seemed to burn with unusual intensity despite the heavy rain. Edmund Warren filed another insurance claim, but the company's investigator noted irregularities in the circumstances that raised questions about the fire's origin. Thomas Warren disappeared entirely in December 1855. According to Elizabeth's diary, he left the plantation early one morning and simply never returned. Unlike Lydia's disappearance, which had prompted an extensive search effort, Thomas's absence was met with resigned acceptance from his family. Edmund Warren told neighbors that his son had gone to seek opportunities in the Western Territories, but no letters or communications were ever received from him. The winter of 1855 brought the Warren family's ordeal to its tragic conclusion. On January 23, 1856, Margaret Warren was found dead in her bedroom under circumstances that the county coroner described as consistent with self-inflicted harm. The official cause of death was listed as poisoning from laudanum, though the amount found in her system suggested either accidental overdose or intentional consumption of a fatal dose. Edmund Warren survived his wife by only 6 weeks. He was discovered by a neighbor who had become concerned about the lack of activity at the plantation. The official cause of death was determined to be heart failure, but those who saw his body reported that he appeared to have aged decades in the months following the tragedies that had befallen his family. His final will, probated in March 1856, contained the unusual provision that the plantation be sold, and the proceeds used to purchase freedom for all enslaved individuals remaining on the property. Elizabeth Warren departed Tallahassee immediately following her father's funeral and never returned to Florida. She moved to Baltimore, where she lived quietly under her married name until her death in 1892. Her personal effects, donated to the Maryland Historical Society, included a trunk containing documents related to the Warren plantation. Among these papers was a letter she had written but never sent to a friend, describing her final weeks at the estate. In the letter, Elizabeth wrote, "I cannot adequately convey the horror that settled upon our home in those final months. There were sounds in the night that defied explanation, and shadows that moved without cause. Thomas spoke to me before his departure of debts that could never be repaid and sins that would follow our family beyond the grave. I fear that what befell poor Lydia was only the beginning of our family's punishment for participating in the great evil of our time." The Warren plantation was sold at public auction in April 1856. The buyer, a merchant from Savannah, planned to continue operating the property as a working plantation, but abandoned his plans after visiting the site. According to records in the Leon County Courthouse, he forfeited his deposit and allowed the property to revert to the bank, claiming that the buildings were unsuitable for habitation. For the next decade, the abandoned Warren plantation became a source of local legend and fear. Travelers along Meridian Road reported seeing lights moving through the ruins of the main house and hearing voices calling out from the empty fields. Children from neighboring properties were strictly forbidden from venturing onto the Warren land, and adults would cross themselves when passing the overgrown entrance to the estate. In 1867, a group of former enslaved individuals who had worked on the Warren plantation provided detailed testimonies to agents of the Freedmen's Bureau. These accounts, preserved in the National Archives, paint a disturbing picture of the conditions that existed on the estate during its final years. Multiple witnesses described instances of cruelty and abuse that had been carefully hidden from outside observers. Sarah Mitchell, the elderly woman who had worked in the kitchen house, provided the most detailed account of Lydia's final weeks at the plantation. According to her testimony, Lydia had confided that she was being held against her will in ways that extended far beyond the normal constraints of enslavement. Sarah reported, "That girl was trapped in ways that ain't got nothing to do with being bought and sold. She told me there were chains on her soul that would follow her into the grave." The testimony also revealed that Thomas Warren had constructed a hidden room beneath the main house, accessible through a concealed entrance in the cellar. Several witnesses reported that Lydia was frequently taken to this room for extended periods, and that sounds of distress could be heard emanating from beneath the house during these times. When questioned about the purpose of this hidden space, the witnesses could only say that evil things happened there that ain't fit for telling. Moses Jenkins testified that Thomas Warren had made him dig a series of holes throughout the plantation grounds during the months before Lydia's disappearance. When asked what the holes were for, Jenkins replied that Warren had told him they were for burying things that needed to stay buried. Jenkins also reported finding items of women's clothing buried in various locations on the property. Though he was forbidden from discussing these discoveries with anyone, the Freedmen's Bureau investigation was quietly terminated in 1868 without any formal conclusions being drawn. The agent in charge of the inquiry, Captain Robert Hayes, noted in his final report that the passage of time and the destruction of physical evidence make it impossible to substantiate the more serious allegations contained in witness testimonies. However, Hayes's personal diary, discovered by his grandson in 1934, reveals his private conviction that serious crimes had been committed at the Warren plantation. In his diary entry for February 14, 1868, Hayes wrote, "I am convinced that the testimonies we have gathered represent only a fraction of the horrors that occurred on the Warren estate. The pattern of abuse, the hidden room, the mysterious disappearances, all point to crimes of such magnitude that they beg a description. Yet without physical evidence or corroborating documentation, we cannot pursue legal action against parties who are, in any case, beyond earthly justice." The abandoned Warren plantation remained untouched for nearly 15 years after the family's demise. In 1870, a group of archaeologists from the newly established Florida State Seminary requested permission to excavate the property in search of artifacts related to antebellum plantation life. The Leon County Board of Commissioners granted the request, but the excavation was halted after only 3 days when workers uncovered what appeared to be human remains in the area beneath the main house. Dr. James Fletcher, the archaeologist leading the excavation, filed a brief report with the county authorities before departing Tallahassee hastily with his team. The report, housed in the Florida State Archives, provides few details about what was discovered, noting only that the remains appear to be those of a young adult female, and the circumstances of burial suggest that proper Christian rites were not observed. Fletcher's personal notes, discovered among his papers after his death, reveal a more disturbing picture. In his private notes, Fletcher wrote, "What we uncovered beneath the Warren house defies rational explanation. The remains were found in what can only be described as a ritualistic arrangement. Surrounded by objects whose purpose I dare not speculate upon, the condition of the bones suggests trauma that occurred both before and after death. We have reburied the remains and sealed the excavation site. Some discoveries are better left hidden from the light of day." The location of the reburial was not recorded in any official documents. and subsequent attempts to locate Fletcher's excavation site have proven unsuccessful. In 1893, a second archaeological expedition attempted to investigate the Warren property, but was forced to abandon the effort when local residents threatened violence against the researchers. The leader of this expedition, Professor William Hamilton of the University of Georgia, wrote in his official report that local sentiment remains strongly opposed to any disturbance of the Warren property, and we have concluded that the potential knowledge gained does not justify the risk to our team's safety. The early 20th century brought renewed interest in the Warren plantation case among academic researchers studying the history of slavery in Florida. In 1928, graduate student Mary Patterson of Columbia University attempted to write her doctoral dissertation on the Warren family tragedy. Her research, which included extensive interviews with elderly residents of Leon County who remembered the events, was never completed. Patterson left Tallahassee abruptly in the spring of 1929 and never returned to finish her work. Patterson's research notes, donated to the Columbia University archives by her estate, revealed that she had uncovered new evidence suggesting that Lydia's story was part of a larger pattern of abuse, involving multiple enslaved women on plantations throughout North Florida. Her notes indicate that she had identified at least 7 other cases of unexplained disappearances involving young enslaved women in Leon and adjacent counties during the 1850s. One particularly disturbing entry in Patterson's notes, dated March 15, 1929, reads, "The pattern is unmistakable once you begin to look for it. Young women, typically described as attractive and light-skinned, disappearing without explanation from plantations owned by wealthy families. In each case, there are reports of strange occurrences preceding the disappearances, and in several instances, male family members abandon their homes shortly afterward. It is as if some terrible contagion spreads from plantation to plantation, leaving destruction in its wake." Patterson's notes also contained transcripts of interviews with elderly African-American residents of Tallahassee who had preserved oral histories passed down from their ancestors. These accounts, while varying in details, consistently describe Lydia as a young woman who possessed what one interviewee called a beauty that brought nothing but sorrow. Multiple sources spoke of her ability to read and write, unusual skills for an enslaved person, and suggested that she'd been educated by previous owners who had treated her more as a companion than as property. The most detailed of these oral histories was provided by Clara Washington, whose grandmother had worked alongside Lydia in the Warren household. According to Washington's account, Lydia had spoken of experiencing visions that showed her glimpses of future events. Grandmama said, "Lydia knew things before they happened, and that gift is what brought all the trouble down on her." Some folks thought she was blessed, but others believed she was marked by something darker. Washington's grandmother had also described finding Lydia on multiple occasions engaged in what appeared to be conversations with invisible companions. She would be standing in the garden or by the well, talking in low tones like someone was right there with her. When you got close enough to listen, she'd be speaking about things that ain't happened yet, warning people who couldn't hear her about dangers that were coming. The 1930s brought a brief resurgence of interest in the Warren plantation when a writer for Collier's magazine attempted to research the story for an article about Southern Gothic mysteries. The writer, Charles Brennan, spent 3 weeks in Tallahassee interviewing local residents and examining historical records. His article was never published, and Brennan's editor noted that the writer had become increasingly agitated during the research process and had submitted a manuscript that was deemed unsuitable for publication due to its disturbing content. Brennan's unpublished manuscript, discovered in his personal effects after his death in 1951, paints a picture of the Warren plantation as the center of what he termed a conspiracy of silence that has persisted for nearly a century. According to Brennan's research, multiple families in the Tallahassee area possessed knowledge about the true fate of Lydia and others like her, but had maintained their silence through a combination of fear and complicity. The manuscript includes interviews with several prominent Tallahassee families whose ancestors had been neighbors of the Warrens. While none would speak on the record, several individuals privately confirmed that their families had long suspected that serious crimes had been committed at the Warren plantation. One source, identified only as Mrs. "My grandmother told me that the Warren place was cursed, and that anyone who disturbed what lies buried there would bring that curse upon themselves." Brennan's investigation also uncovered evidence that the Warren plantation had been used as a meeting place for what he described as a secret society of plantation owners engaged in activities that went far beyond the normal brutalities of slavery. According to his sources, this group gathered regularly at various plantations throughout North Florida and South Georgia to participate in rituals that combined elements of religious ceremony with acts of extreme cruelty. Told Brennan, "There are things that happened in those days that decent people don't speak of, but the sins of that time cast long shadows." The manuscript describes these gatherings as centered around the belief that certain enslaved individuals possessed spiritual powers that could be harnessed through specific rituals. According to Brennan's research, Lydia had been identified as possessing such powers and had been acquired by Edmund Warren specifically for participation in these ceremonies. The manuscript suggests that her eventual disappearance was the result of a ritual that had gone terribly wrong. In 1942, the abandoned Warren property was purchased by the state of Florida for inclusion in a proposed state park. The plans called for clearing the overgrown vegetation and constructing recreational facilities on the site. However, the project was cancelled after preliminary site surveys revealed what officials described as structural instabilities that made construction inadvisable. The true reason for the project's cancellation, according to internal state documents discovered decades later, was the discovery of additional human remains during the survey process. The surveyor's report, filed with the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, noted that ground-penetrating equipment had detected multiple anomalies consistent with disturbed soil and buried objects throughout the property. When test excavations were conducted, the report noted that materials were uncovered that necessitate immediate cessation of all activities pending further investigation by appropriate authorities. No further investigation was ever conducted, and the Warren property was quietly transferred to private ownership in 1948. The buyer, a timber company from Jacksonville, harvested the mature trees from the land, but made no attempt to develop the property for other uses. Company records indicate that workers consistently refused to remain on the site after dark, and that several employees quit their jobs rather than continue working at the location. The 1950s brought the last serious attempt to uncover the truth about the Warren plantation mystery. Dr. Robert Blackwood, a historian specializing in antebellum Florida, received a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to conduct a comprehensive study of slavery in Leon County. His research, which began in 1954, was intended to culminate in a definitive academic work on the subject. Blackwood's research progressed normally for the first 2 years, with the historian gathering materials from archives throughout the Southeast. However, his focus gradually narrowed to concentrate almost exclusively on the Warren plantation case. His correspondence with colleagues reveals an increasing obsession with uncovering what he called the hidden truth that connects all the seemingly isolated incidents of the 1850s. In a letter to his research assistant dated September 19, 1956, Blackwood wrote, "I am convinced that the Warren case represents only the visible portion of a much larger and more sinister phenomenon. The patterns I have identified in plantation records throughout the region suggest a coordinated effort to suppress evidence of systematic atrocities that far exceeded the ordinary horrors of slavery. If my suspicions are correct, we are dealing with crimes that have been deliberately obscured by decades of silence and misdirection." Blackwood's final research notes, found in his office after he suffered a nervous breakdown in 1957, contained increasingly erratic observations about connections between historical events and what he termed occult influences on antebellum plantation society. His notes for December 3, 1956 read, "The evidence is overwhelming that Lydia possessed abilities that marked her for targeting by forces that most rational people would refuse to acknowledge. Her fate was sealed not by random cruelty, but by her unwilling participation in rituals designed to harness spiritual energies for worldly purposes." The notes also contain detailed maps showing the locations of plantations throughout North Florida and South Georgia where similar disappearances had occurred during the 1850s. Blackwood had identified a pattern of what he called spiritual warfare, in which enslaved individuals with perceived supernatural abilities were systematically targeted for exploitation by their owners. According to his research, this network of plantation owners had maintained communication through coded letters and shared their victims through a system of loans and exchanges. Blackwood's final coherent entry, dated January 7, 1957, reads, "I have located the central coordinating point for these activities. The evidence points to a location in the Apalachicola National Forest, where the final rituals were conducted. If I can find physical proof of what occurred there, I will have the evidence needed to expose this conspiracy of silence. The voices of the victims deserve to be heard, even after all these years." Blackwood was found 3 days later wandering along Highway 27 in a state of complete disorientation. He was hospitalized for nervous exhaustion and never returned to his research. His notes and documents were sealed by court order at the request of his family and have never been made available to subsequent researchers. Blackwood spent his remaining years in a private sanitarium in North Carolina, where he died in 1978 without ever speaking publicly about his discoveries. The Warren property changed hands several more times during the 1960s and 70s, but no buyer ever attempted to develop the land or construct permanent buildings on the site. Each successive owner would hold the property for a few years before selling it at a loss, often citing unexpected difficulties that made their intended projects unfeasible. Real estate records from this period show a consistent pattern of rapid turnover and declining property values despite the generally rising market in the Tallahassee area. In 1968, a group of students from Florida State University attempted to camp on the Warren property as part of a folklore research project. The students, who were investigating local legends and ghost stories, intended to spend a week documenting any unusual phenomena they might observe. Their project was terminated after the first night when all 5 students fled the property in the early hours of the morning, reporting that they had experienced what they described as overwhelming feelings of dread and the sensation of being watched by unseen observers. The student's faculty advisor, Professor James Mitchell, filed a report with the university administration describing the incident. According to his report, the students had been well prepared for their research project and had shown no signs of nervousness or apprehension before beginning their investigation. However, their account of their single night on the property was so disturbing that Mitchell recommended that the university prohibit future student research activities at the location. One of the students, Janet Crawford, provided a detailed written account of their experience that was preserved in the university's folklore archives. According to Crawford's report, the group had set up their camp near the ruins of the main house and had begun recording ambient sounds and taking photographs as darkness fell. Around midnight, they began hearing what sounded like voices calling from different directions around their campsite. Crawford wrote, "At first, we thought it might be local residents trying to frighten us away, but the voices seemed to come from everywhere at once, and they were speaking words we couldn't understand. As the night progressed, the sounds became more insistent, and we began to feel an overwhelming sense of panic that none of us could explain rationally. By 3 a.m, we had all agreed that we needed to leave immediately, despite having no logical reason for our fear." The 1970s brought the final chapter in the documented history of the Warren Plantation mystery. In 1976, the property was purchased by a development company planning to construct a residential subdivision on the site. The developers, apparently unaware of the property's history, began clearing operations in preparation for construction. The project was abandoned after heavy machinery operators reported consistent equipment failures, and several workers claimed to have seen apparitions in the wooded areas of the property. The development company's project manager, Robert Hayes, provided a statement to the Tallahassee Democrat newspaper describing the difficulties they had encountered. According to Hayes, expensive bulldozers and excavating equipment experienced inexplicable breakdowns on a daily basis, despite being recently serviced and in excellent mechanical condition. Additionally, several crew members had reported hearing screams coming from areas where no people were present. Hayes told the newspaper, "In 30 years of construction work, I've never encountered a site that presented so many unusual challenges. Our equipment failures alone cost the company over $50,000, and we were unable to retain a stable workforce due to the constant reports of disturbing incidents." From a purely business standpoint, the project became economically unfeasible. The final attempt to develop the Warren property occurred in 1978, when a group of investors planned to construct a shopping center on the site. Preliminary excavation work uncovered what appeared to be additional human remains, along with artifacts that the construction crew described as unsettling in nature. The county coroner was called to examine the discovery, but his report was never made public, and the development project was quietly cancelled. Following this final failed development attempt, the Warren property was purchased by a private foundation whose stated purpose was to preserve historically significant sites in North Florida. However, the foundation has never allowed public access to the property, and its exact identity has remained confidential. The land remains undeveloped to this day, slowly returning to the wild state it was in before Edmund Warren first saw its potential as a plantation site. Local residents continue to report unusual phenomena associated with the former Warren plantation. Drivers along Meridian Road sometimes claim to see lights moving through the trees or to hear voices calling from the direction of the property. These reports have remained consistent over the decades, suggesting that whatever forces were awakened by the tragedies of the 1850s have never been laid to rest. The story of Lydia Warren, if that was indeed her name, remains one of the most disturbing chapters in Tallahassee's antebellum history. Her fate, and that of others like her, serves as a reminder that the documented horrors of slavery represent only a fraction of the suffering that occurred during that dark period of American history. The silence that surrounded her disappearance, and the continued reluctance of researchers to investigate the full truth of what occurred at the Warren plantation, suggests that some secrets are considered too terrible to be fully revealed. In the end, perhaps the most haunting aspect of Lydia's story is not what we know about her fate, but what we can only guess at based on the fragments of evidence that have survived. The testimonies of those who knew her speak of a young woman who possessed both extraordinary beauty and what appeared to be supernatural awareness of her impending doom. Whether she truly possessed psychic abilities or was simply a victim of circumstance remains unknowable, but her story continues to cast a shadow over the Red Hills of Leon County more than a century and a half after her disappearance. The Warren Plantation stands today as a monument to the capacity of human beings to inflict suffering upon one another, and to the lengths to which people will go to hide their crimes from history's judgment. The overgrown ruins of the main house and outbuildings serve as silent witnesses to events that proper society has long preferred to forget, but which refuse to remain buried beneath the kudzu and Spanish moss that now claim the property. And on certain nights, when the wind moves through the ancient oaks and the moon casts long shadows across the abandoned fields, local residents claim that you can still hear a young woman's voice calling out across the darkness, seeking justice for crimes that have never been acknowledged and wrongs that have never been made right.